Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3, on page 1355. Aleph Shinun Hey. After explaining that there are three types of makabel, meaning an that does not have the capacity on its own, totally on its own, to generate light. There's only one category, only Shemesh, only the sun has that capacity, which God created it that way. The other three types of makabel, all in some different way, in each in their own different way, requires the sun or other form of light to make sure to make it function properly. So we're talking about moonlight. In the words of the Rebbe Rashab, the moon, the light of the moon, which receives the light of the sun. Now, the moon is its own entity. It's a celestial body of its own. It's not an extension of the sun, but the light of the moon receives the light from the sun. And then it radiates also with the light that it has inherently within it, as we discussed. The second is Habeis Erde Even Teiv, the glow or shine of a bright stone or a gem. So here you don't say it's an atzma, it's not its own light. The properties of this particular stone have acquired and assumed the quality ma'ir shemesh, and therefore ve'ena cheshech machshir chesed. So even when it's dark, it doesn't darken. That glow is there. Va'gimel ha'ir hariyah, the light of our vision, of sight. She'ena eir hameir lahayir. It's not a light that can shine and illuminate in the dark. That's why we don't see in the dark. Zolose, I'm sorry. It cannot radiate outside of it, only to itself, because it has the power of vision, as we talked about, visualizing something, envisioning that clarity. But for it to be able to see an object outside of it, meaning not within yourself, within your mind, that you need always a light, a separate light, which is either sunlight or daylight or candlelight. And all these three are makabel, he called. And he explained, but before that, he explained the differences. We learned yesterday, the differences between each one has, as I said, a different quality, strength, and a weakness. In the context of Hariyah, the sight, the eye itself is fundamentally a world of light, clarity. That's why you can see even in the dark, or a blind person, or in a dream. However, on the other hand, as far as actually being able to see objects, it needs constantly another light, and it does not absorb sunlight. So it's not like when like in one room where the eye can see because there's a candle burning. If it goes to another room, it's not going to see because the eyes don't retain anything. On the other hand, the moon, the same thing with a bright stone, they retain. So even if they so-called move to another area, the glow of the stone will be there. And the light of the sun, the moon will have a light because it has something of its own that's also light. But the difference being the moon absorbs in the sense where it always is dependent on the sun because it's always sunlight. Whereas the bright stone, what it appears that he said, does acquire it, it does retain it. And therefore it's also a quality that the stone can glow even when there's nothing. Whereas the moon will glow, but it's always glowing with the light of the sun. However, the moon has absorbed it to the point, like he said, the bittel that the moon has, or like I explained it, that it shines even when the sun is not shining directly there, meaning even in the night. So we're going to learn more about the differences between them, but that's basically briefly how he summed up what we learned inside. And there, they don't need that other light dependent on it all the time as vision does. The words that he used was that by the vision, sight, the light of vision, of sight, there, the outside light is only siyua bilvad. It's not being absorbed by the eye. It's only supporting the eye. The eye should be able to see in a dark place. So you need an outside light. when it comes to the moon and the stone and the bright stone, both of them, you call them really actually absorbers. They absorb. They're not just, the light isn't just supporting them, it's actually being absorbed by them. So that is another distinction I should have mentioned. Okay. Now the Dugma Mikol Zeh. What is all this coming to explain? This is an example to what? To explain Zah and Malchus. That Zah is Be'etzem Mahusei is Mashpia, and Malchus is Be'etzem Mahusa is Mekabel. I explained yesterday the idea of a Mashpia and Mekabel, how everything is set up in that structure, and specifically in the world of Spheres, in the world of Atzilus and Spheres, Zah is the Mashpia, and Malchus, and not just Mashpia, but Etzem Mahusa, that's its role, and Malchus is Mekabel. And he explained this is not just in a state where there's a diminishment or a flaw. This is the natural state. This is not a state that was superimposed, but the natural state of existence, even before the miyut, meaning before the diminishment of Malchus, the diminishment of the moon. You also had two Shnei Me'eres Agdelim, and they were both equally strong, but they were still Mashpia Mekabel. Why? Because Malchus has to receive from Zah. But it receives it, like he said, b'derech Maaver. That Malchus is receiving from Zah, the moon from the sun, so they're equal strength, but doesn't mean one does not receive. What means receive? He means b'derech Maaver. It passes through Zah. And we're going to learn about that more in this parentheses now, what that means exactly. But I wanted to add one more point about Mashpia Mekabel that I think could help understand this whole subject matter. Yesterday I explained it's because of Achdus and Iskalulus, the unification of all of existence, so everything is give and take. Since everything complements each other. So there's a harmony in that sense. Secondly, we spoke about Midas Daim is Shalish, Shalish, Shalach, Shalach. The opposite of Iskal is live and let live. Me, I'm me, and you. Which also creates a certain, besides the Achdus Hashem, it creates also a, say tension is not the right word I'm looking for, but a certain fragmentation. And I also mentioned David HaMelech when he asked Hashem, why did you create wealthy and the poor? You have all the money in the world. And Hashem said there should be chesed. Chesed, the emes mayit sarua, for there be chesed. If everybody was self-contained, there was no one that in need of anything, and there will be no chesed. So essentially, those that are given more is for them to share what they have. So now we have the concept of chesed. But there's one more variant be made, which will, I think, really help understand why did Hashem make the sun and the moon, Mashpia Mekabel, when we're talking about before the miyut. There was no challenge yet. The moon had not yet challenged God and said, we can't have one king with two crowns. I'm sorry, one king, one crown for two kings. So why did he make a Mashpia Mekabel? So one good way to explain it is the story with Korach. So we know Korach also asked Hashem that question, asked Moshe Rabbeinu, he challenged him. He said, Madua tisnasu. Why did you and Aaron make yourself greater than everyone as leaders? The whole community, the whole nation is holy. So why is there a hierarchy in the first place? Now, you don't really find an answer. When you read the Parsha, you just find out that Korach was wrong and his people were punished for it. But what's taka the answer? Or we like to say it in Chabad. I talk many times, Korach was the night when Gimel Tammuz happened, was Motzei Shabbos Pasha Korach. So Korach basically challenging, what is a Rebbe? Why do you need a Rebbe? Why everybody's equal? So the answer for it is the same question that's asked, why do you need Atzilus? If God created existence, and including the lowest of worlds, and actually the real kavanah is not Tachtenim, the lowest of worlds, as the Alter Rebbe explains in chapter 36, because that's where the intention is. In the higher worlds, what's the kavanah? What's the point? Atzilus is Gili Elikus, divine revelation. But higher than Atzilus is even higher revelation. So what's the point of Atzilus? Like he says, the higher levels are all Yeridim. So it's only due because there's something in this world that is not just, it's not revelation, the opposite, the concealed world, because God wanted dafka in a concealed world, in a world that was completely, where it was the total concealment of godliness, that's where you should create a home for God. So the question is, so then why do we need Atzilus? Why do we need higher worlds altogether? And the answer is very straightforward, because think of it this way. Think of a child saying, what do I need teachers for? What do I need parents? What do I need role models? Why do I need a mentor? The answer is the way God created existence, that it should be on our terms. It would be a complete miracle for Tachtenim to suddenly jump to Atzmus and say, hey, we want a connection to God. That's why we talk so much about the process. Mutfa, Murgesh, Muskel, the ladder, the stepping stones, especially Mamata Lamaila, because it wants to be, because the whole point of Adira B'Tachtenim should be internalized. And for it to be internalized, we have to grow. And to grow, you need to receive from something greater than you are. We're not born with all the wisdom in the world. Even though in our mother's womb we're taught the entire Torah, but we're made to forget consciously. Now comes the process. Ben Chumash, first you learn Aleph Beis, then Ben Chumash Lemikra, 5 you learn Chumash, at 10 you learn Mishnah, at 15 Gemara, and the mind expands, which is essentially the whole reason that why was there at Tzimtzum in the first place? In order to really create an independent consciousness. But now comes the question the other way around. How can an independent consciousness reconnect and retrace the steps? So we need mashpiyim. That's why you need mashpiyah and makabel. So even though in the beginning of creation, Malchus was equal to Zah, Shnei Me'eres Hagdelim, 2 great luminaries, the sun and the moon. But nevertheless, everything is built in that one receives from the other, even if the mashpiyah is not greater in quality, but still everything comes from the higher levels, comes down to the lower levels in the form of mashpiyah and makabel. And that creates the concept, that of course requires bittul, that the lower level empties itself in order to receive the higher. If Malchus was created like Zah, 2 separate tracks, and it doesn't receive from Zah, besides the other reasons I gave earlier, that there wouldn't be Achdus, because there would be separate tracks, each one connecting to God in their own way. Another thing, Malchus would never have the concept of bittul, that it's receiving from its teacher, so to speak. It's receiving from its mashpiyah, from Zah, would not allow it to really grow. Then Malchus would have light, Zah would have light, 2 different lights. Mashpiyah Makabel also implicitly is implicit in that also the concept of bittul, that allows each of us to open up to receive from something beyond, higher than us, integrate it, and continue to grow in that process. So Mashpiyah Makabel is far more than just because one has less, so it needs to receive from the one that's greater. It's also the very concept of creating growth and development is essentially Mashpiyah Makabel, parent, child, teacher, student, and so on. Yeah. Okay. Now let's talk about how this happens, the Maaver. I want to take you back to page 1209, literally the beginning of volume 3, 3rd page in volume 3. So at the bottom of page, so there he cited, I'll just sum it up briefly. He cited there that in Eitz Chaim talks about different levels of how the sun and moon interact. There are actually 7 levels, what's called 7 levels in Aliyas HaMalchus. So for example, let's just take the moon, physical moon. So we know the moon goes through stages, right? It goes through its cycles. At Rosh Chodesh, the moon is born. So you don't even see a speck, you don't even see anything. The moon is born, a new moon. Then as it moves as it waxes, it goes into the first quarter. So the moon is now like a quarter filled. Then it goes into the second, which is the half month. A full moon at the 15th of the month. Around the 22nd of the month, the 3rd quarter, the moon is now 3/4 full. Or actually, no, the 3rd quarter is starting to wane. I'm sorry, it's just the other half, right? And then all the way to the end of the month, when again it diminishes, and this goes through a process every month. Okay, now with that said, that is the physical side of it. In Ruchnius, Malchus has also stages as it interacts with Zah. There's where Malchus is just a newborn, like Rosh Hashanah. We say the Binyan HaMalchus. Rosh Hashanah is always Rosh Chodesh, the first day of of Tishrei. So it's the beginning, the birth. Then it begins to grow, so to speak. So Malchus called Aliyas HaMalchus or Binyan HaMalchus. So there's 7 stages, actually. We're not going to go through all 7. He just referred to them back on page 1208 and 1209. But the question is not like this. When they were created, the sun and the moon, we just established they were Mashpia and Makabel as well. But how did Malchus receive its light from the sun? So he called it B'derech Maaver. Now, we learned Maaver and Slapshus is very different. Maaver means like a mashpach, like a funnel. When something travels B'derech Maaver, it means it's just passing through. It doesn't assume the properties of that higher level. Like, for example, when you pour wine through a funnel, the funnel is supposed to be completely transparent in the sense it's just funneling the wine. It doesn't add or diminish any. When you pour water through a filter, the filter absolutely does things. It can filter out things. You can have additives. So the idea of a Maaver is when you say something goes b'derech Maaver, you're saying it's passing through. It still has an impact, as we're going to learn in the Geras HaKodesh, from a Geras HaKodesh, but it's not quite. Hislapshus means that you're completely manifest in that state. For example, when a teacher is giving an example in teaching something, that's b'derech hislapshus. He's taking an idea, he's explaining it with another idea in order for us to understand it. Maaver is you don't really find in the hashpah of a teacher to a student. Maaver would be more, like I said, passing through. So you have to travel through that level, but it still retains its original properties and is not deeply impacted by the hislapshus. So you see, he says the word here that it meant it did come through Zah. That's why it's Mashpia Makabel, but it's B'derech Maaver. Now, on page 1208 and 1209, when he spoke about the sun and the moon, let me see what line I'm looking for. So he talks there that after the diminishment of the moon, when the moon becomes full, and you say Kaima Sirba Shlemusa, it's still not as powerful as the sun. So even a full moon never goes back to the state as it was before the miyut, before it was diminished. Let me just go over the story of the diminishing, just not to take for granted that you know what it is. So the Gemara Chulin says that the Levana came to the God and said, "You created 2 great luminaries, myself and the sun. That's what it said. You made 2 kings, but they both can't have 1 crown. Basically, you have to make one the king, one king with 1 crown, and he's the king. You have 2 kings with 1 crown. So God said to the Levana, if that's the case, you diminish yourself. The crown will go to the king, will be the sun, and you'll receive the light from the sun. So the point here is he still would receive the light from the sun, even if there wasn't this diminishment. But now as an added thing, the moon actually became weaker than the sun, which was not the case before this diminishment. And Chassidus explains at length, and we've learned it as well, what the point is. That's Malchus being diminished. But at the end of the day, as the Eitz Chaim explains, as Malchus grows through Avodah, there'll come a point where Malchus will become just as strong. The sun, the moon will become again one day when Mashiach comes, just as strong as the sun. And he uses an expression, I'm using it because this is an introduction to what we're going to learn now. He says the expression like this. So when there's a full moon today, even the time of Shlomo Melech, I'm reading at the top of page 1208, the Zohar Malchus beginners ponim beponim v'shavim became awesome. That Zohar Malchus, the sun and the moon, are face to face, and their shavim became awesome. Ach kisre l'mayla mikisra. Nevertheless, the crown of the sun is higher than the crown of the moon. U'mekabelo sa'eres ha'edei hazah. So even when the moon is full, it's not quite on the same level of as the sun. He says, the seventh level. He says, he says, never that level never happened. And he says, what's that level? Let me just see something, 1 second. That level will be Kesed Echad L'Shneim. And now the Eitz Chaim says it was never happened. He asks on top of page 1209, what do you mean? Before the creation that happened? I'm sorry, before the miyut, before the diminishment that happened. So he explains it, and I'll explain it briefly in a moment. I just wanted to point this out. So then he says, then there'll be a level where the moon won't receive from the Shemesh. And we've been learning about this in Ayin Beis. What's that level? That the Helam itself reaches from the Helam Atzmi, higher than Oir. That it won't be dependent, it won't be the sun shining at night. It will be that the moon itself will be able to connect to its source that's higher than the sun. And he calls that, I'm sorry, no, that's not that level yet. No, that's a level before that. He calls that level the seventh level, and he says then the Levana Malchus will receive from Tiferes the Ima directly, just like Zoh receives. So will not need to receive it from Zoh. And that's why the Levana will be like the Eir Hachama. Then he says there's another level, Laila Kayem Yair, where the moon itself will be transformed to Helam Ma'atzmi. That's what I was referring to, but that's not so relevant to our discussion now. I just wanted to add that. He actually calls that a level 8. And at the bottom of page 1209, he explains he doesn't count that because that's a completely new level that's higher than all the whole cosmic order in the first place. Second. Just one moment, please. Let me just repeat it in case it was confusing. So, in general speaking, the concept that the moon itself will radiate with its own source from Helam Ma'atzmi is not part of our discussion. I'm mentioning it only because it shouldn't be confusing, because we did learn this. So that is not moon to Helam source. That's very clear. But in relationship of this moon to the sun, you have where the moon is. Oh boy. Is it getting choppy now again?
Yes.
Got a message. Choppy?
Just briefly, you're okay, basically. No, it happened again as soon as I said that. Now you're silent and not moving.
Are we having a problem?
I don't know. What, you just continue. What else can you do?
Okay. You'll tell me if you can't hear me. Okay, so we're talking the context of light of the moon and the light of the sun. So here there's the different stages, like I just described throughout the month. But then there's the concept where the moon and the sun in the beginning of creation were, before there was a diminishment, were in equal stature, but the moon received through the sun. Then there are levels where the moon is, but there's still equal strength. After the diminishment, the moon became weaker. But La'asid Lavi says the Eitz Chaim, they will go back to that state where they're the equal stature. So then the question is that something that already existed before the diminishment, or something new that will happen La'asid Lavi? So on page 1208 and 1209, he says like this. of page 1209 that the difference is as follows. Before the diminishment, the beginning of creation, it was still b'derech Maaver. Derech Maaver is true. It does not it does not affect the light, so the light is in the same intensity. But he brings there, okay, it does have some effect. Whereas La'asid Lave, the Eitz Chaim is saying that it won't even have Maaver. It'll take it straight from Bina, and therefore it'll be not even passing through Zah. That's what will be La'asid Lave. That's what I wanted to bring up. Okay, and how you like okay. So now let's learn inside on page 1355. So he said now there's Mashpia Makabel, Sun and Moon, Zah and Malchus. They're equal in stature. However, Malchus is receiving it through Zah. So the Mashpia is not changing the intensity of the transmission. By the way, how's the sound? Everything going good? Hello?
Yeah, you had some rough moments. Yeah, no, you had some rough moments. And like you at the word, I think you said the moon gets directly from Bina.
Can we do the class, or is it too? Is it breaking?
You can do the class, but you know, it's this is pre-Mashiach class. That should be better.
But they're the equal strength.
Now you
But
blocked
it
out
is
for
going
that
through
one.
the sun, through Zah. But I am Mashikoso Besider. I don't know what to tell you.
You have some technical person you can ask what you can do to remedy this situation. Do you need a more powerful computer or something? I mean, is there anything that we can do long term for this? Just sunspots, who knows what causes this? Boy, is this frustrating. Did he say the Labana gets it from Bina and I guess the sun gets it from Chachma?
Okay, we're back on. Can't understand
Yeah.
what's going on. I don't know what's happening here, to be honest. To go.
Maybe you have tech people, ask them what could be done. Maybe somebody knows.
Okay. Connection seems good now.
Very good now.
Okay. I'm going to start the second recording. Okay. So we're discussing now how Zah and Malchus interact and how the moon receives light from the sun. So he said, even before the diminishment, Malchus always received from Zah because it's Mashpia Makabel. But in the parentheses, he now qualified, he said, I am Ashakasa Besider. It says Malchus receives from Chachma Shaloya de Zah. So how is that consistent with what we just read, just learned? So he answers, V'tzarech lemer, you have to say, Shezeu Gamkein Aydei Maaver Hazah. You have to say, even when Malchus is receiving straight from Chachma, in other words, not through Zah, it's also passing through Zah. In other words, it's not skipping over. Think of an express train. An express train may not stop at a local stop, but it does passes through that stop. So even when Atzilus, let's say, goes into Asiya, it still has to travel through Bria. Same idea. Moichin, even if Malchus is receiving straight from the highest level of the divine intellect, meaning Chachma, it still passes through Zah. That's how he's explaining the reconciliation. Like it says elsewhere, okay. That the ashpa of speech, which is Malchus, has to be through midas, through the emotions. So let's explain. Let's explain in a simple English. Moichin or Chabad or Chachma is intelligence, the cognitive mind. Midas is emotions. Malchus is expression, dibur. Malchus takes either the intellect of the Chabad, of Chachma, or the midas, the emotions of Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Zah, that's the midas, and expresses it. But the fact is that it's very possible that you could speak without any emotions. A person can be learning an idea, and there's no emotional element to it. In other words, it's bypassing emotions. You could be speaking emotionally about things that are very personal and very subjective and emotionally passionate and so on. But you can also speak very coldly about an intellectual idea. That would be Malchus receiving straight from Chachma. So what he's saying here is that even that has to go through midas to some extent. It may not assume the passion and the emotional aspect of Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Chayid, Yesod of a midas, but it still travels through that. That's what he's saying. So even though Malchus is receiving straight from Chachma, in some way, it still goes through midas. Because when you communicate from the mind through speech, you still have to travel through the midas. The only difference is the midas are not impacting directly the communication. Is that clear? Okay. Achalfi Mashakos Sham, in that Mokemacher, what does he explain? According to what he explains there, he says, so what is the role? So give an example. He gives an example. Hamoshel. He gives an example for this type of transmission that's coming from Dibur straight from Chachma and only passing through Midas. It's like a person who didn't really plan to speak, but when a person is very active, his mind is very busy, he may just say sometimes an expression, he may just say something. Like you're learning something and inadvertently you come out with an expression, you say, oh, wow. Or you just say, you express yourself. So it's Dibur. It's not coming in an organized way through Midas, but it's coming Metirdas HaSeichel, Derech Mamela. He says, "V'cheinu b'lekutei Torah ba'abir d'v'hoya misper," and that's how he explains in Lekutei Torah in the Maaver in Bamidbar v'hoya misper. Yesh leimesh zo. So according to that, so what role do midas have altogether? It's coming purely from the mind. Yesh leimesh zo gam shelo yayidei Maaver hazah. 1 second, let me see what he said. Okay, so he's saying, yes, there is a scenario where you don't, where the midas, you're not even passing through midas. And that's the example. So he says, so in general, when a person speaks and it's coming from the mind, it also has to travel through midas to some extent. But there is a scenario when a person inadvertently, automatically speaks because of his tirdas haseichel, his mind is very busy and he's just expressing himself. He says, and that's what it says, that that's a level that's not even passing through Zah. It's bypassing it altogether. It's from Chachma, from Moichin, from intellect straight to speech. Because that speech is not being defined in any way by a personal expression. It's like it's like something just inadvertently expressed itself from your mouth. That's what he's saying here. So I'm going to explain it more in detail, but I just want to get out. Well, let's learn it inside. So he's giving examples of how Malchus and Zah interact or don't interact. So there's a level where Malchus is receiving from the same place Zah is receiving, two equal luminaries, the moon and the sun, but it travels through Zah, at least passes through. Then there's a level he's now saying that it goes from even a higher, that is coming from a place that doesn't even pass through Zah. Okay. V'yesh leimer, and we can say the Masher Koser Be'etz Chaim being Keser Echad, that what it says in Eitz Chaim about one Keser, remember we learned one Keser for 2 crowns, for 2 kings. Sheteferes di'imo hayagam b'bchinas Keser lenukve. That when we say that in the beginning of creation, or when Mashiach comes, there'll be one crown for both of them. What's that crown? So the Eitz Chaim says that's the level of Tiferes of Bina, Tiferes Ima. And that will be a Keser both for Zah and for Malchus. That's why I was referring to page 1204, because that's where he says that explicitly. In the name of 1208, 1209 rather. Let me just look for a second. Okay, so what it says in Eitz Chaim, he says, Yesh Leimer. Yesh Leimer, Mashkos Eitz Chaim, Gam Ken HaKavona Ken HaHanal. Is also the intention is like that what? That I think it passes. 1 second, let me see. Okay. I don't want to confuse matters, so I want to just pause a moment, and step back, just to explain this a little more patiently. I've been jumping a little here, and with this also internet being down is just create more confusion. So I don't know if you're following along as well, but what he's trying to establish here goes very much hand in hand with what he said back on page 1209. And I'm trying to balance the two. That's why I'm going back and forth. It's not so clear to me right now, but it sounds like this. There's a state where, one second, let me just see one more thing. There's a state where Zah and Malchus, or sun and moon, are mashpia and makabel. In that itself, there can be many levels, but generally two, where the makabel is weaker than the mashpia, or that it's equal to the mashpia, but it still has to travel through the mashpia to the makabel, even if it's just passing through. Then there's a level where Malchus, the makabel, receives straight from the source and doesn't even have to bypass the shemesh, the sun, Zoh. That's what he's trying to sort out here. And he's bringing from different places that establish in each place a little differently what the levels are. So I want to just break it down so far what we figure out. Then I'll stop and I take any questions and we'll go over it more in detail. So it goes like this. At the beginning of creation, when God created two luminaries, Shnei Meis Agdelim, he created Mashpia and Makabel. Right away, the sun is a Mashpia Zoh, and Malchus is a Makabel, period. And they're both of the same strength, because they're both receiving from the same source, which is Tiferes of Ima. They're receiving from Bina, which is higher than Zoh and Malchus. So think of it like Chachma and Bina are father and mother. They give birth to Malchus. Malchus also, that's the way it was at the beginning of creation. When the moon complained, so God diminished the moon. He diminished the moon. So it's probably getting choppy again now, right?
Somewhat.
He diminished the moon, so now, in addition to the moon receiving from the sun, or Malchus from Zoh, even before the diminishment, there's also a diminishment. And that's all the work we do, is to rebuild the moon, Malchus, firstly, to receive from the sun properly, and then to receive back from the source, even higher than the sun, even higher than Zoh, and ultimately from the highest levels of Hela Ma'atzmi. Clear. That's clear. Now, in this process, the Rebbe Rashab is separating and saying the following. In Siddur Rashar Resh Chedesh, it says that Malchus receives some Chachma directly, not through Zoh. So how is that consistent? So he says you have to say that's also passing through Zoh, because even Dibur is speaking wisdom, it has to also pass through the Midas, at least through. However, there is a state where it doesn't have to pass through either, and that's the motion. The person inadvertently speaks because of his busy mind, so he just blurts out words. He says that's taka state that doesn't even need Zoh. That's going straight from Chachma to Malchus. What it says in Eitz Chaim, that in the beginning, there was that Keser Echad, Tefez D'Mehoyagam B'chinas Keser L'Nukva, that Keser of that the Teferes of Ima is like a crown both to Zoh and to Malchus. That apparently is talking that they're both getting straight from Bina, without Maaver of Zoh. But in chapter 2 in Eitz Chaim, he says, Achnire be'Eitz Chaim Sham Perik Beis, the Kedem HaKitrug, that there was a difference. that before the complaint of the moon, they were equal, only back to back, and the Kesser of Zoh was higher than the Kesser of Malchus. So then Malchus was receiving also from Zoh. So then what does he mean that Malchus is receiving straight from Tiferes of Ima, not through Zoh? So he's going to say that comes through Avodah. The Avodah that we do elevates Malchus to the point that it can reach all the way higher than Zoh, all the way up to Bina, where it's receiving its own energy, not through Zoh. But in the beginning of creation, it did go through Zoh, at least b'derech Maaver, at least passing through, which has an impact on it. I don't know if this made things clearer, but that's essentially what he's saying. I'm going to wait till tomorrow to explain this more in detail, and hopefully I'll have a clearer internet and things will be smoother here. But at least we covered some ground here. Does anybody want to ask anything? Or it's all so confusing that you can't even ask?
It is confusing. And also one more question. It said, Lelosi Lovoi, the moon will be like the Chamo, but the Eure Chamo will be 7 times. What does that mean?
Okay, it's a fair question. I'll answer that all tomorrow better, because it's all one part of a bigger picture and it needs an explanation of the overall, the whole picture here. Let's stop here. And I will, as I said, tomorrow, try to explain it from the whole picture. I'm going to go back to this and back to page Aleph Reish Ches Tes, see exactly what he says. Okay. Anybody want any other comments? Anybody else wants to say anything?
What do we say? Sometimes it comes from Chachma, and sometimes we use Bina for Levana. I'm not sure.
For all practical purposes here, Chachma and Bina is not, it's not distinguishing. He's just talking about it's different levels, but they're both higher than Zoh. That's the bottom line. I think it's like father and mother. Chachma is where the seed comes from, and Bina is where the development of the idea comes from. And that's what's giving birth to Zoh and Malchus. The question is, are they equal stature? Are they receiving from one another? That's what I want to untangle a bit and try to present in an organized fashion. But I see I need to look up Eitz Chaim. Yeah, I actually once wrote down all the 7 levels. Anyway, I'll go over it and get back to you tomorrow. I'll hopefully explain it better. Okay. Okay, let me close this. So we're in the middle of